We begin with President Donald Trump in Hamburg, Germany today, where he's gathering with world leaders for the G20 summit. The president will be holding several bilateral meetings over the coming days. Here he is earlier speaking with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, but his most anticipated one-on-one will be tomorrow when he sits down for the first time formally with President Vladimir Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Trump started the day in Warsaw, delivering a keynote speech in the Polish capital. He also held a brief press conference, and here is what he had to say when asked about Russian meddling in the U.S. election.
Well, I think it was Russia, and I think it could have been other people in other countries. Could have been a lot of people interfered. I said it very simply. I think it could very well have been Russia, but I think it could well have been other countries, and I won't be specific, but I think a lot of people interfere. I think it's been happening for a long time. It's been happening for many, many years. Now, the thing I have to mention is that Barack Obama, when he was president, found out about this in terms of if it were Russia, found out about it in August. Now, the election was in November. That's a lot of time. He did nothing about it.
Zeke Miller is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for Time magazine, joining us now. Zeke, we just heard those comments from the president. Why does he continue to publicly question whether or not Russia was involved in meddling in our election?
You know, we're seeing over the last 2 or 3 weeks now this sort of presidential two-step here when it comes to Russia, at once blaming the Obama administration for not doing more before the election, and then sort of raising doubts about the intelligence community's assessment of Russian culpability. In the latter case, I mean, to your question, the president is certainly feels that his legitimacy is undermined as president. You know, if Russia, if he sort of accepts Russia's culpability, that means potentially it had some sort of impact on the election, and that would potentially, in his mind, make him look less presidential. And he's very sensitive to any sort of questions along those lines. So we had those remarks when he was asked about Russian meddling, but then in his scripted remarks, in the speech that he gave there in Warsaw, he called Russia destabilizing in reference to Ukraine. Looking ahead to this meeting with Vladimir Putin, is there any indication of how he may handle the meeting when he seems to be speaking in two very different ways about Russia? There really isn't. Certainly his staff, which was very involved in drafting those prepared remarks, wants him to take a very, a very tough line when it comes to Russian meddling in the election, in addition to its actions in Syria and eastern Ukraine and elsewhere in other trouble spots around the globe. The president, going back a year now, talking about Vladimir Putin, praised him as a geostrategic genius. Tried to sort of even going into the White House said perhaps the U.S. and Russia can have a much closer sort of relationship. All of those hopes were sort of dashed, largely around Syria policy in February and March. But the president seems to be the last person to recognize the finality of that. He thinks that if the two of them can get into a room, maybe they can hash out some sort of agreement. Really, his staff wants him to take that tough line, but there's only one person who knows, and that's the president of the United States, and hopefully we'll all find out tomorrow. Yeah, I was going to say that 5 Democratic senators have said that they will put a letter together saying that they want him to address Russian meddling with Vladimir Putin, but ultimately it will rely on the president when he is in that meeting tomorrow. We haven't been given any more or any further indication as to the agenda that we'll see there tomorrow, have we? No, not at all. I mean, staff has been very cagey about this meeting. They're not talking about the issues that they're going to raise. That's something that we've seen with other foreign leaders, where when it comes to the meetings with Shinzo Abe of Japan, North Korea is going to come up, trade issues are going to come up. We've heard nothing of the sort from White House officials about the president's agenda there, and it's not really clear that the president and his aides are reading off the same playbook. The aides can be hoping that their boss will take a tough line or raise a certain issue with Vladimir Putin, but there's really no way of knowing for sure, particularly given this meeting, given how strongly the president feels about the Russia issue in particular. And the other top issue there, North Korea, and President Trump did address North Korea's latest missile launch. Let's listen.
As far as North Korea is concerned, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I don't like to talk about what I have planned, but I have some pretty severe things that we're thinking about. That doesn't mean we're going to do them. I don't draw red lines. It's a shame that they're behaving this way, but they are behaving in a very, very dangerous manner, and something will have to be done about it.
Something will have to be done about it. Not really a lot of details there. Do we have any idea of the White House strategy at this point?
This has been a trouble spot, for the last several presidents, where there really aren't a lot of pressure points that the U.S. or the international community at large has when it comes to North Korea. The president has sort of tried to get China on board through its own sort of goodwill early on. That came out of that Mar-a-Lago summit in March with Xi Jinping that the president talked a lot about. And then after this launch, sort of indicated that in his view, that strategy had failed. We saw last week the White House and the administration roll out, at the beginning of what are called secondary sanctions on Chinese companies that do business with North Korea in violation of UN and U.S. sanctions. That seems to be the least worst option on the table for the U.S. government right now. Certainly, that given the G20 meeting, President Xi is also there. That is certainly going to come up, and that would strain the relationship, the budding relationship that the president is trying to build with his Chinese counterpart as well. So there are a lot. They're playing 3D chess right now. There really aren't very many good options, but secondary sanctions are the ones that the White House officials say that's sort of at the very top of the the most likely option that they're looking at right now. You
mentioned the relationship with President Xi Jinping, but it seems that North Korea would be the more pressing issue and of more importance than having that good relationship.
Certainly, one would think, particularly given this latest advancement in ICBM technology. But China is also one of the U.S.'s biggest trading partners, holds a ton of U.S. debt. There are other issues at play in terms of Chinese actions in the South China Sea, in terms of trying to, and so they're all interconnected, and it makes it very challenging, even given North Korea, how critical that threat is right now, for the White House to try to figure out just how much pressure can they put on China on the North Korea issue without destabilizing and sort of undermining all of the other progress they want to make on these different issues.
You mentioned trade, and leaders today from Japan and the EU announced a massive trade deal. Even as President Trump tries to dismantle or renegotiate some of the deals involving the U.S., what does this do to our bargaining power right now?
Certainly, it sort of puts the U.S. a little bit further down the line. Obviously, America is a massive market that all these other countries want to have free trade agreements with. It's generally in their interests to do that. But certainly, if we're seeing, after the failure of TPP, Japan went, sort of looked the other direction for its own trade deal with the EU and sort of bumped that up on the priority list. It really does call into question, as President Trump did pull out of TPP right after he took office, just how serious is he about renegotiating or negotiating to begin with free trade agreements with other countries and regional groups around the globe. We saw the beginning of discussions around NAFTA a couple of weeks ago, but we haven't seen a lot of progress, at least publicly. We haven't seen firm timetables that the president of the White House would like to see for these things. And at a certain point, that really could jeopardize the U.S. position if other countries sort of get their act together and fill the vacuum that right now is being created.
The G20, also the president's first meetings with world leaders since pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. And that was obviously criticized by so many of our allies, universally criticized, really. Angela Merkel, who he was meeting with earlier, was very critical of that move. So now what? What does this mean? What pressure might he face?
Certainly, we saw a little bit of a taste of this at the G7 meeting back in May, when it was President Trump versus everyone else, and here at the G20, the odds are going to be further stacked against him. Because here we're talking about China is on board on the Paris Climate Agreement, even when the U.S. is pulling out. India, other countries are there, and so for the president, they're going to have to navigate how they talk about the issues of climate. The president, can't always be seen as being a dissenting voice in those conversations. And certainly Angela Merkel and others aren't going to let him off the hook. They want to bring up these issues, if only to highlight their own leadership on the international stage. They view the U.S. retreat on the Paris Climate Agreement as an opportunity for, certainly Germany does, China does, as an opportunity to sort of affirm their status on the global stage as geopolitical powerhouses. And they're not going to shy away from those issues just because President Trump doesn't want to talk about them. They're going to bring it up just because he doesn't want to talk about them.
All right, Zeke Miller, interesting few days ahead with the G20 summit. We appreciate the information. Thanks, Zeke.
Thanks for having me.